I had been out of work for a few months, and the bills were starting to pile up. So when I saw a night shift security job at an old graveyard, I didn't hesitate to apply. It wasn't exactly the kind of work I had envisioned for myself, but desperation makes you overlook things, especially when the job is easy money. I was given a small rundown of what to expect. A quiet shift, no troublemakers sneaking in, just a lot of empty land and tombstones to keep watch over. It sounded peaceful enough, even if the thought of patrolling a graveyard alone at night did make my skin crawl a little. The first night was when I received the list of rules, handed to me in an old, tattered envelope by the man who worked the day shift. He didn't say much, just looked at me with tired eyes, gave me the paper, and told me to read it carefully. "These aren't suggestions," he said before leaving without another word. That was odd enough, but when I opened the letter and read the rules, I felt a chill run down my spine. Rule 1. Occasionally, you may see figures wandering the graves, weeping, or placing flowers. These are not people. Do not approach them or speak to them, no matter how much they beg for help. If one of them notices you, immediately retreat to the security booth. Lock the door and remain silent until they leave. Rule 2. If you notice a fresh grave during your rounds, approach it cautiously and place a hand over your heart as a sign of respect. If you hear scratching or knocking from beneath the earth, walk away without responding. Do not linger near fresh graves longer than necessary, and never dig or disturb the soil. Rule 3. At some point during your shift, you may see a tall figure standing near the center of the graveyard. It will be draped in what looks like a funeral shroud, with a body made out of other dead people's body parts. Do not acknowledge it in any way. If it starts moving toward you, calmly walk in the opposite direction. If you run, it will follow, and once it reaches you, it will take your body parts next. Rule 4. There is an old, rusted bell mounted on the gate of the cemetery, long abandoned and unused. If at any point during your shift you hear it ring, you must hide immediately. Do not hesitate, and do not come out of your hiding spot until you hear footsteps walk past you. If you choose to ignore this, something evil will see you and take your soul. Rule 5. There may come a moment when you hear faint singing, as though it's coming from a choir far off in the distance. The voices will sound beautiful at first, haunting even, but as they grow closer, you must resist the urge to follow them. If you listen too long or attempt to locate the source, you will find yourself lost in the graveyard, and no matter how far you walk, the exit will always be just out of reach. Rule 6. There's an old chapel on the grounds, long abandoned and boarded up. Occasionally, you might see lights flicker from inside as though someone is moving through the halls with a candle. Do not attempt to enter the chapel no matter what. If you do enter, you may not be able to exit. Rule 7. Once in a while, you might come across a grave that looks freshly dug, with the dirt piled off to the side. Do not approach it, and do not investigate who or what may have disturbed the grave. If you notice movement from within the pit, continue your rounds and act as if you saw nothing. If you linger too long, whatever was buried there may decide it's time to trade places with you. Rule 8. The graveyard has old lanterns that flicker randomly. If you see more than 3 lanterns go out in quick succession, stop whatever you're doing and look directly at the ground. You'll feel a cold presence pass by. Once the presence is gone, relight the lanterns immediately. Failing to relight them will cause the dead to rise and bring you down to the darkness of their grave. Rule 9. Do not leave before you finish the night shift. No matter what, if you do, they will follow you until you reach your grave. I remember standing there for a good few minutes, just staring at the paper in disbelief. It had to be a joke, some twisted initiation ritual for new hires. I almost crumpled the paper up and tossed it away, but something deep inside me told me to keep it. As I made my way to the small security booth near the entrance of the graveyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I was sure it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. It wasn't until I began my first patrol that things started to feel off. The graveyard was eerily quiet, more so than it should have been. No wind rustled the leaves of the ancient trees. No distant hum of traffic could be heard. It was as though the world outside the gates didn't exist, and all that remained was the cold, suffocating stillness of the cemetery. I walked slowly between the rows of gravestones, my flashlight cutting through the thick fog that clung to the ground. My heart pounded in my chest, and every crack of a twig beneath my feet made me jump. I kept repeating the rules in my head, trying to reassure myself that nothing would happen as long as I followed them. About halfway through my patrol, I spotted something in the distance, a figure standing by one of the graves. My stomach dropped as I remembered Rule 1. I could hear soft sobbing, the figure hunched over a gravestone, its shoulders shaking with grief. The figure looked human enough, dressed in dark, tattered clothing, but I knew better than to trust my eyes. I quickly turned and made my way back to the booth, keeping my head down and my steps steady. I didn't dare look back, but the sound of weeping grew louder as I walked, as if the figure was following me. My hands were trembling by the time I reached the booth and locked the door behind me. For what felt like hours, I sat in silence, listening to the muffled cries outside, praying that it wouldn't try to get in. Eventually, the weeping stopped, but I didn't feel any relief, only an overwhelming sense of dread. My next encounter came when I noticed a patch of freshly turned earth near the center of the graveyard. I hesitated, but Rule 2 was clear. I had to approach it with respect. My heart raced as I walked toward the grave, placing my hand over my chest like the rule instructed. The moment I did, a faint scratching sound came from beneath the soil. My blood ran cold. I turned on my heel and walked away as quickly as I could without breaking into a run, resisting the urge to look back or investigate further. I could feel eyes on me, though I knew there was no one else around. The night stretched on, each moment more unnerving than the last. I found myself checking the old lanterns frequently, counting them to make sure none had gone out. It wasn't long before 3 of them flickered out all at once. My breath caught in my throat, and I immediately looked down at the ground, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air around me grew impossibly cold, and I felt a presence glide past me, so close I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I waited until the coldness lifted before relighting the lanterns with shaking hands. As I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I had followed the rules and that nothing would happen as long as I stayed vigilant. But the longer the night dragged on, the more I began to doubt my own sanity. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of rustling leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. My flashlight began to feel like my only lifeline, the beam of light the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. At one point, I heard the faintest hint of singing, soft and melodic, like a choir singing from far away. I froze, remembering Rule 5. I had to resist the urge to follow the sound. It was harder than I thought. The song was so beautiful, so otherworldly, that for a moment, I wanted nothing more than to find the source. I shook my head, forcing myself to move in the opposite direction, doing everything I could to ignore the haunting melody. The further I walked, the fainter the singing became, until it finally disappeared into the night. My nerves were completely shot by this point. I had survived each encounter, but the graveyard felt more hostile, as though the very air had turned against me. That's when I saw it, the tall figure in the center of the graveyard, standing perfectly still under the pale light of the moon. It was exactly as the rule described, draped in a funeral shroud, with a grotesque patchwork body of mismatched limbs and decaying skin. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to look away and calmly walk in the opposite direction. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I knew better. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. My skin crawled, but I kept my pace steady, my breath shallow as I resisted the urge to glance over my shoulder. The footsteps eventually faded, but I didn't allow myself to relax. By this point, my heart was pounding so violently in my chest that it hurt, the pulse reverberating in my ears as I remained crouched in the tight space under the desk, every muscle in my body tense. My breathing was shallow, almost ragged, and the air in the booth felt too thick, suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beyond the door, waiting for the smallest mistake. My eyes flicked toward the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the darkness outside. The moonlight barely illuminated the rows of tombstones, casting long, twisted shadows across the cemetery grounds, each one resembling a figure hunched in the distance. The night was silent again, unnervingly so, and that silence only heightened the knot of fear tightening in my gut. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if something had shifted just out of sight. Slowly, I rose from under the desk, my legs stiff from crouching, and approached the window cautiously. My hands were trembling as I reached for the flashlight, my fingers barely able to grip it. Shining the beam out into the graveyard, I swept it across the graves, moving from headstone to headstone, searching for any sign of movement. My throat tightened when I caught sight of a figure, hunched over one of the graves near the far end of the lot. I knew instantly what it was, one of the weeping figures. Its pale form was barely visible, cloaked in a shroud of darkness, but I could make out the slow, shuddering movements of its shoulders as it sobbed quietly into the night. I swallowed hard, reminding myself of Rule 1. Do not approach, do not speak, no matter how much they beg for help. My chest felt like it was being crushed as I forced myself to step away from the window, my mind racing with the possibilities of what might happen if it noticed me. Part of me wanted to run, but I knew better. If I panicked, if I made any noise, it would see me, and then there'd be no getting away. For a few agonizing moments, I stood frozen in the booth, my body screaming for me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I was trapped by my fear, paralyzed by the overwhelming terror that had gripped me since the start of the shift. The figure's sobbing grew louder, more desperate, like it was in pain. My heart clenched at the sound, but I bit down hard on my lip, drawing blood to keep myself from reacting. Every instinct I had screamed to help, to check if someone was actually out there, but I knew that wasn't the case. They were never people. They were something else. Just as I took a shaky breath, preparing to move away from the window entirely, the sobbing stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the crying, sending a cold wave of dread washing over me. Slowly, I glanced back toward the grave. The figure was standing now, its face tilted upward, staring straight at the security booth. My blood ran cold, my stomach dropping as I realized it had seen me. Without thinking, I bolted to the door, slammed it shut, and locked it, my hands fumbling with the keys as my panic overtook me. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on the dark silhouette just outside. It wasn't moving, but I knew better than to assume it was gone. It was waiting. I sank into the corner of the room, gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it could hear it. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity, as I waited for the inevitable sound of something scratching at the walls or rattling the doorknob. But it never came. The silence stretched on, the tension in the air becoming unbearable, and every second that passed felt like it was pulling me deeper into a pit of fear and paranoia. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat ran down my back, but I didn't dare make a sound. Then, just when I thought I might break from the sheer terror, there was a soft creak outside, like the shifting of weight on the old gravel paths. I barely breathed, straining to hear anything else. Another creak followed, this time closer, and I clenched my teeth, praying it wouldn't come any nearer. But the footsteps grew louder, heavier, until they stopped just outside the booth. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the flashlight to my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. It was there. It had to be. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, waiting for me to make the mistake of looking out the window. Seconds felt like hours as I waited for whatever it was to move on. My throat was dry, and my mouth tasted of copper from biting my lip, but I didn't dare move. Slowly, the creaking steps faded, growing more distant until there was nothing left but the sound of my own ragged breathing. I opened my eyes, cautiously standing up, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. Every second of this shift felt like a lifetime, and the fear was wearing me down. But I had to continue. I had no choice. With shaking hands, I forced myself to unlock the door and step back outside, my eyes scanning the graves for any sign of movement. The figure was gone, but the graveyard was far from peaceful. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and the flickering lanterns cast long, distorted shadows that made everything seem far more sinister than before. I kept my head down, sticking to the path as I resumed my rounds, doing my best to keep calm even though I could feel the weight of the cemetery pressing in on me from all sides. The eerie quiet settled over the graves once again, but I knew better than to trust it. Every nerve in my body was on edge, anticipating the next encounter. As I passed by a cluster of older graves, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A fresh grave, its soil newly turned and damp, sat near the center of the plot. My throat tightened as I remembered Rule 2, my hand instinctively moving to cover my chest as a sign of respect. I didn't dare get too close, my body rigid with fear, but just as I turned to walk away, a soft, rhythmic tapping sounded from beneath the earth. My stomach lurched, and I froze, my mind racing. The knocking was faint but unmistakable, like something was trying to get out. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to stay and investigate. I knew the rule: walk away, don't linger, do not respond. Every step I took felt like it was pulling me deeper into the unknown, and the fear gnawed at me as I distanced myself from the grave, praying that whatever was beneath the soil would remain there. I continued walking, my breath shaky, my thoughts racing. The memory of that faint tapping still echoed in my mind, and I found myself glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting something to burst from the ground and come after me. But the graveyard remained still, its eerie quiet more unnerving than ever. The wind had picked up slightly, and it whispered through the trees, making the branches creak and sway like skeletal fingers reaching out to me. My heart was still pounding, and every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally, like it was alive. I kept my pace steady, not wanting to show any sign of fear, though inside I felt like I was falling apart. As I rounded the next corner, I caught sight of the old chapel in the distance, its crumbling walls barely visible through the overgrown vines that clung to its exterior. A shiver ran down my spine. Rule 6. Do not enter the chapel. The lights were flickering inside again, a soft, almost inviting glow spilling from the broken windows, and for a brief moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to go inside, to see what was causing that light. But the rule echoed in my head like a warning bell, and I shook my head, forcing myself to look away. Whatever was inside that chapel, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. My body felt heavy with exhaustion, the weight of fear pressing down on me more and more with each passing minute. I just wanted this shift to be over, but I knew better than to even think about leaving. The rules were clear, and Rule 9 had made it obvious. Leaving before the shift was done wasn't an option. They would follow me. My hands were cold and clammy, the flashlight slipping slightly in my grip as I moved further into the cemetery. The lanterns were spaced out ahead of me, casting weak circles of light on the path. I counted them as I walked, a nervous habit I had developed over the course of the night. 1, 2, 3. I stopped dead in my tracks. The fourth lantern had gone out. My heart jumped into my throat, and I spun around, scanning the area for any other extinguished lights. Another one flickered and died. Then another. 3 lanterns had gone out in quick succession, just as the rule had warned. I could feel the blood draining from my face as I remembered Rule 8. Stop whatever you're doing and look directly at the ground. I didn't hesitate. My head dropped, my eyes fixed on the dirt beneath my feet, and I stayed perfectly still, not daring to move a muscle. The wind had stopped, and the air around me felt unnaturally cold, as if the warmth had been sucked away. A chill swept through me, and I could feel something, a presence, moving nearby. It was close, too close. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a deep sense of dread settled in my chest as the cold grew more intense. Whatever it was passing by me, and I could feel its icy breath, hear the faintest rustle of something shifting in the shadows. My body screamed for me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I couldn't. I had to follow the rules. I had to wait. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the cold lingering, the presence hovering just out of sight. My heart pounded so hard that I was sure it could hear me, but I kept my eyes glued to the ground, not daring to look up. Slowly, the cold began to fade, and the oppressive feeling that had been suffocating me lifted ever so slightly. I exhaled shakily, not even realizing I had been holding my breath. When I was certain the presence was gone, I looked up. The lanterns were still out, their flames snuffed, and the darkness in that part of the graveyard felt thicker, almost alive. My legs trembled as I forced myself to move, my fingers fumbling with the lighter in my pocket. I had to relight them. That was part of the rule. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the lighter, but I managed to strike a flame and relight the first lantern. As soon as the flame flickered to life, the oppressive darkness seemed to retreat, and I breathed a small sigh of relief. I moved to the next lantern, then the next, carefully reigniting each one, though the fear that had gripped me didn't ease. The dead had been close, too close, and if I had hesitated for even a moment, I wasn't sure what would have happened. Once the last lantern was lit, I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of the small flames calm my nerves. But the unease didn't go away. I could still feel something watching me, waiting for the next mistake. I forced myself to continue my rounds, though every step felt like I was walking deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The moon had shifted higher in the sky, casting a pale glow over the gravestones. But that did nothing to ease the darkness that seemed to hang over the cemetery. As I approached the center of the graveyard, I felt a sudden chill, colder than anything I had felt before. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I froze in place, my eyes darting around, searching for the source. That's when I saw it. The figure, tall, draped in a tattered shroud, its body a grotesque patchwork of limbs and flesh stitched together. It stood in the middle of the graveyard, unmoving, but I could feel its eyes, if it had any, boring into me. Rule 3. Do not acknowledge it. Do not run. My legs were like lead, but I forced myself to move, slowly walking in the opposite direction. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my heart hammering in my chest, but I knew I couldn't run. If I did, it would follow. My pace was steady, but each step felt like a death sentence. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, as if it was daring me to look back, to break the rule. Sweat trickled down my face, mixing with the cold air, and my throat was dry as I kept my gaze forward, focusing on the path ahead. I didn't know how long I walked, but every second felt like an eternity. The figure remained behind me, a looming threat that I couldn't shake, and my mind raced with the thought of what might happen if it chose to move. Would it take my body next? That thought lingered in my mind as I continued walking, my legs trembling with every step. The urge to run was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't. My heart pounded violently in my chest, and the air around me seemed to grow colder by the second. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare let my eyes wander from the path in front of me. But then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, rising from the figure behind me. My blood turned to ice as the sound grew louder, morphing into an agonized scream that echoed through the graveyard, bouncing off the gravestones and ringing in my ears. My breath hitched in my throat, and panic surged through me. It had noticed me. The thing was screaming, and in the back of my mind, I knew what that meant. It was coming for me. My pulse quickened as I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, uneven footsteps pounding against the earth, rapidly gaining on me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I remembered the rule: calmly walk in the opposite direction. I forced myself to keep my pace, each step agonizingly slow as the entity's footsteps grew louder, its screaming filling my ears, sending waves of terror through me. I clenched my fists, fighting the desperate urge to break into a sprint. It was getting closer, so close. I could almost feel the air shift behind me, the presence of the thing looming over me like a shadow, but I didn't turn around. Couldn't. My hands were shaking, my palms slick with sweat, and my legs felt like they were about to give out from beneath me. Just a little further. The security booth was up ahead, its lights barely visible through the fog that had started to roll in. I could make it. I had to make it. The thing's screams grew more frantic, more desperate, and I could hear the horrible, wet sound of its feet slapping against the ground, as if they were made of mismatched, rotting flesh. I fought to keep my composure, but my breath was coming in short, panicked bursts, and my vision blurred from the sheer terror coursing through me. The security booth was just a few feet away now, but the entity was nearly upon me. I could feel the weight of its presence, the awful stench of decay filling the air around me. My heart pounded in my ears as I reached the door, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for the keys. The screams were right behind me, so close I could feel them vibrating in my bones, but I didn't look back. I shoved the key into the lock, twisting it with trembling hands, and threw the door open just as the entity's footsteps reached the edge of the booth. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it with shaking hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a split second, there was silence, as if the thing had stopped, as if it wasn't going to follow me. But then, the sound of heavy, labored breathing filled the air outside the booth, and I knew it was still there. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, the tiny room suddenly feeling like a prison. The entity outside let out another scream, this one more guttural, more primal, and the next thing I knew, it was banging on the door. The entire booth shook with the force of its blows, and I could hear the hinges creaking under the strain. My mind raced with fear, my entire body trembling as I stared at the door, praying that it would hold. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as the creature outside continued to slam its body against the booth, its screams tearing through the night like a warning. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat as I backed further into the corner, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for it to burst open at any second. The security booth felt suffocating, the air thick with the stench of fear and the creature's putrid breath leaking through the cracks. Each bang sent a jolt of terror through me, and I was sure the door wouldn't hold much longer. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my breathing, but it was impossible with the sound of that thing just inches away. Desperate to get inside, my mind raced, wondering if this was it, if the booth would give in and I'd be torn apart piece by piece. My chest tightened, my entire body tensed as the entity continued its assault on the door. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise, oppressive and suffocating. I didn't dare move, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for the next sound, the next blow, but nothing came. The creature was still out there. I could feel it, its presence lingering just beyond the thin walls of the booth, but for now it had stopped trying to get in. My knees felt weak, and I collapsed into the chair behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to steady my nerves. The pounding of my heart slowly began to subside, but the fear didn't leave. It never left. As I sat in the security booth, trembling from the terrifying encounter, I found myself questioning my sanity. How had I ended up here, trapped in this old graveyard, facing unspeakable horrors? The silence outside was oppressive, but the creature's presence lingered in my mind like a dark cloud, suffocating and heavy. I tried to convince myself that I had survived, that the danger had passed, but the thought offered little comfort. My eyes darted around the small booth, searching for anything that might offer a clue about what I was dealing with. I thought about the rules, the warnings that had been drilled into me before I started my shift, and I realized that the only thing keeping me safe was my adherence to them. As I took a deep breath to calm my racing heart, I heard a faint rustling outside, a sound so subtle that it could have been the wind, but I knew better. I could feel the weight of something watching me, lurking just beyond the door, waiting for me to make a mistake. I forced myself to focus, recalling the last rule, the one that warned me not to leave before the end of my shift. What would happen if I did? Would I carry the curse of the graveyard with me, followed by the ghastly figures and the shrouded entity? The thought alone sent chills down my spine. I knew I had to hold on until dawn, until the first light pierced the darkness that engulfed this cursed place. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity as I forced myself to stay alert, my eyes scanning the shadows. I couldn't allow myself to drift into a restless slumber, not with the unknown lurking just outside. Time passed painfully slowly, and I felt the oppressive weight of the night settle deeper into my bones. But then, just as the first hints of light began to filter through the trees, something shifted in the atmosphere. The air felt electric, charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I could sense it before I saw it. The creature outside was no longer there. The silence was so profound that it echoed in my ears, and I felt a mix of relief and trepidation wash over me. I cautiously approached the door, my heart pounding as I reached for the handle, fearing what I might find when I stepped outside. I took a deep breath, counting down from 3, and flung the door open. The graveyard was bathed in the soft, golden glow of dawn, the world transformed by the early morning light. The graves stood peacefully, the figures I had seen earlier nowhere to be found, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. But as I stepped out into the open, my breath hitched in my throat. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of finality, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the horrors of the night weren't truly over. I turned back to the booth, preparing to lock it one last time, and that's when I noticed the tall figure standing in the distance, motionless among the gravestones, draped in its funeral shroud, a grotesque reminder of the night's terrors. I could feel my heart plummet as it turned its head slowly toward me, its body seeming to stretch impossibly tall and twisted. But this time, instead of fear, a strange sense of understanding washed over me. I had made it through the night. I had followed the rules, and I was still here, alive. In that moment, I felt an inexplicable connection to the creature. I had become part of its world, a world of shadows and whispers, and I understood that I could never truly escape it. As the sunlight enveloped me, I took a deep breath and began to walk away, glancing back only once to see the figure slowly fade into the light, its scream now a distant echo that would forever haunt the edges of my mind. I stepped beyond the gates of the graveyard, leaving behind the darkness and the nightmares, but I knew that the memories of that night would never leave me. I would carry them like scars, a testament to the horrors that lurked in the shadows, and as I made my way into the waking world, I understood that sometimes survival comes with a price, a weight that I would bear as long as I lived. But for now, I was free, and that was enough. After this incident, I tried telling police what had happened, but they dismissed me as if I was a madman. I even found the ad of the job, still up innocently as if it hadn't almost been the end of me. I tried to find another job, but with minimum experience, I could only find sketchy jobs at places like Sally's Food Superstore, 24-hour petrol station stop, or even as a babysitter in a place that is in the middle of nowhere. Who knows what will happen if I work at any of these places? As long as I don't have creatures trying to take my body parts, I'll be all right.